Racist judge, she thought she was merely another black teenager with an attitude until Amira revealed she was a licensed attorney investigating him. The courtroom had its rhythm, a quiet hum of shuffled papers, the occasional cough, and the dull murmur of lawyers exchanging last-minute strategies. Yet today, there was something different in the atmosphere. The tension was so thick that it felt like the walls themselves were leaning in, eager to see what would unfold. At the center of it all, Judge Raymond Lancaster sat perched high on his bench above the rest of the room, his presence like an ancient, unmovable oak. He had occupied that chair for 3 decades, with his reputation carved into the wood just as deeply as it was wedged into the lives of those standing before him. He was a man of routine, predictable, unwavering, and though he would never admit it, he appreciated things being a certain way. That's why, as 19-year-old Amira Daniels stood before him in worn jeans and a simple blouse, he barely looked up from the case file. Another case. Another young black woman wasting the court's time. He already anticipated how this would conclude, having seen it 100 times before. His fingers drummed lazily against the bench while he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Daniels," he drawled, dragging her name out as though it were an inconvenience. "I see here that you were arrested for interfering with police business, resisting arrest, a direct violation of—" He paused, dismissively waving a hand toward the uninterested prosecutor. "Frankly, it doesn't matter. You were told to move, and you didn't. That's a problem." The audience, mainly spectators with nothing better to do, chuckled at his dismissal of her. The officers who had arrested her stood stiffly near the door, arms crossed, smug looks on their faces, while Prosecutor Richard Calloway barely lifted his gaze from his notes. Amira remained silent, observing and listening, unfazed. Judge Lancaster tilted his head, waiting. When she didn't respond immediately, his lips curled into a mix of impatience and amusement. "Miss Daniels, do you think this is a joke?" Finally, she spoke. "No, Your Honor." "Then I suggest you show some respect for this court and take responsibility for your actions. Maybe if you had paid more attention in school, you wouldn't be standing here today." That one condescending remark triggered a shift in the room, almost imperceptible but noticeable. A hush spread thickly and slowly, snickering ceased, and even the prosecutor glanced up from his papers. Amira, however, did not flinch. She inhaled slowly, reflecting on herself before slipping her hand into her bag. The bailiffs took a reflective step forward, and the judge rolled his eyes, clearly preparing to dismiss whatever feeble argument she was about to present. But when she pulled out a sleek black leather case and flipped it open on the table, the atmosphere shifted completely. The courtroom froze. Inside the case was a bar card, shiny, polished, unmistakable, a document that only licensed attorneys possessed, something that should have been impossible for a 19-year-old. Amira placed it on the defense table, tapping it lightly with her finger. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, and steady. "I did pay attention in school. I graduated law school at 18 and passed the bar on my first attempt. I'm here undercover for a legal watchdog organization." It took a full 3 seconds before anyone in the courtroom reacted. 3 seconds of dead silence before whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Lancaster's smirk vanished. The prosecutor sat up straighter, frantically flipping through his files, while the officers near the door exchanged glances. The game had changed, but Lancaster was not ready to admit defeat. The silence stretched, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats as their own discomfort filled the gaps where words should have been. Even the air felt heavier. Judge Lancaster blinked, his brain attempting to catch up with the reality he had just witnessed. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, his eyes darting to the bar card on the table, as if staring might cause it to vanish. It didn't. Murmurs in the courtroom swelled, transforming whispers into hushed conversations. "Who is she? Is this real?" The bailiffs shifted uneasily, while Prosecutor Calloway flipped through his papers, looking for an answer that might be buried in his notes. Amira stood unmoving. She wasn't gloating, smirking, or waiting for applause. She quietly observed the judge, patiently, as if waiting for him to comprehend a reality he had never deemed possible. Lancaster cleared his throat, forcing his voice back to the surface. This is ridiculous, he scoffed, the sound forced and hollow. A stunt, a lie. There's no way, he turned toward Calloway. Is there any record of this woman being a member of the bar? Calloway hesitated. I don't know, Your Honor. His fingers scrambled across his keyboard, typing furiously, his face losing its color. Lancaster turned back to Amira, irritation bubbling in sharp bursts. So what? You think this changes anything? You were still obstructing an arrest. Amira tilted her head. Was I? The question landed like a hammer. She reached into her bag again, slowly and deliberately, as if daring anyone to stop her. This time she pulled out a thin folder and placed it on the table. Your Honor, she stated, her voice steady and confident. This is the body cam transcript from the officers who arrested me. She continued, it shows I asked a single question. What's the charge? That was the extent of my involvement. No threats, no obstruction, just a question. She slid the folder toward the bailiff, who hesitated before picking it up and handing it to Lancaster. The judge snatched it, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the first few lines, and his jaw tightened. Amira pressed on, her voice unwavering. The Supreme Court has ruled that speech alone does not constitute obstruction unless it directly interferes with law enforcement actions. Asking a question is not a crime. Lancaster clenched the edge of the folder, stating, That's not for you to decide. She met his glare with an ease that unsettled him. It's already been decided. Houston versus Hill, 1987. The Supreme Court held that individuals have the right to verbally challenge police officers without fear of arrest. If you'd like, I can cite additional cases where officers were found to have unlawfully detained civilians for simply speaking. More murmurs rippled through the courtroom as people leaned forward, their eyes locked onto the young woman dismantling the judge in real time. Lancaster's face darkened, and he turned back to Calloway, who remained glued to his screen, typing frantically. Well, Calloway cleared his throat, his voice strained. Your Honor, she is a licensed attorney. Her credentials check out. The tension in the room cracked wide open. A wave of whispers coursed through the audience. A journalist in the back reached for their phone, and a bailiff's mouth parted slightly before he caught himself. But Lancaster struggled to allow the shift to settle. His pride, his authority, hung by a thread, and he wasn't about to let a 19-year-old cut it. This is highly inappropriate, he snapped. You come in here, disrupt my court, and expect me to what? Dismiss your case because you think you're smarter than me? Amira didn't blink. No, Your Honor. I expect you to dismiss my case because the law requires you to. The word struck like a blow to the ribs. But Amira wasn't finished. She moved closer to the defense table, planting her hands on the polished wood. Her voice lowered, forcing everyone to lean in. And while we're here, we should also address something else. She paused just long enough to build tension. Your Honor, I have been reviewing transcripts of your past rulings, and a troubling pattern has emerged. A cold sliver of silence sliced through the room. Reaching into her bag one final time, Amira placed a thick stack of documents on the table. Would you like to discuss the statistical breakdown of your sentencing disparities? Judge Lancaster's entire demeanor shifted, but he wasn't the only one in trouble. The whole courtroom could sense it. Amira's words weighed heavy in the air, settling over the courtroom like an impending storm. The stack of documents lay untouched, but its presence alone made Lancaster shift in his chair. His eyes darted from the pages to Amira, as if pondering whether acknowledging them would make them real. Deep down, he already knew their contents, as did she. Your Honor, Amira continued, her voice calm and methodical. Over the past 10 years, your sentencing record shows a consistent pattern. She let her words linger in the air before continuing. For defendants charged with similar offenses, black individuals receive harsher penalties than their white counterparts. In some cases, twice the recommended sentencing. A ripple of unease coursed through the room. A journalist near the back scribbled furiously. while Prosecutor Calloway appeared uncomfortable in his chair. Lancaster exhaled sharply, patience wearing thin. This is not relevant to today's hearing. It is if you intend to rule against me, Amira countered, because that would turn this into yet another case added to your growing list of discriminatory rulings. For the first time since the proceedings began, the judge was left speechless. Amira leaned forward and slid the thick folder closer, flipping it open. Let's start with a case from 5 years ago, she said, pulling out the first page. A white college student arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. You dismissed the charges, citing youthful indiscretion. The courtroom fell completely silent. Amira flipped to the next page. A black high school senior. Same charges, same circumstances. Sentenced to 60 days in county jail. The tension in the air thickened. Lancaster gripped the arms of his chair. And here's another white defendant for possession of marijuana. First offense. You ordered probation. She presented the next document. And a black defendant with the same charge. First offense. You gave him 3 years. Enough. Lancaster barked, his voice cracking. This is not a trial against me. No, Amira replied smoothly. But maybe it should be. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, and someone in the back let out a low whistle. Even normally stoic bailiffs looked anxious. Amira leaned forward, her voice dropping. I'm not the first person to notice your pattern. Your Honor. Civil rights organizations have been collecting this data for years. And you know what they found. Lancaster remained silent. They found that your courtroom has one of the highest racial sentencing disparities in the state. And that's not merely an opinion. It's a fact. The judge's hand hovered over his gavel but didn't strike it because he knew she was telling the truth. The room felt as if it was tilting, the balance of power shifting with each word coming from Amira's mouth. But she wasn't through yet. She pulled out one final sheet of paper and held it up. This is a formal complaint filed with the Judicial Conduct Board last month. She allowed that to sink in. Multiple attorneys have alleged bias in your rulings. And guess what? This case, my case, was flagged as part of their review. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Lancaster's face. He was aware of the implications. A formal investigation, public scrutiny, and if sufficient cases were found to be unjust, disbarment would follow. The reporters in the back had ceased taking notes. They were merely watching a judge who had spent decades comfortably in power squirm for the first time. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, and the entire nation was about to witness it. But Amira wasn't finished yet. Judge Lancaster's grip on his gavel tightened, his knuckles turning white as the tension mounted. He could feel the eyes of the audience watching, waiting. Thick anticipation filled the air, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to on this side of the bench. Clearing his throat, the rasp in his voice betrayed his unease. This is a courtroom, not a media circus. You have no authority here, Miss Daniels. You are the defendant, and I am the judge.